For those of you that have given me topics to cover, please be aware I am actually getting to them. It just takes me a little while to kind of gather all my thoughts into something that I feel makes a good enough video to be worthy of recording. One of those comments that I've been milling around a lot in my head was a comment asking about me giving a discussion on the difference between old school DMing and new school DMing. And the reason that it took so long to kind of get to this one in particular is because those terminologies are very packed, but also very loose. So they contain a lot of information, but they're very loosely agreed upon. So having the discussion about what the nice elements of a new style DM versus an old style DM is very difficult because like new school and old school mean completely different things to different people. And having to define the terms before we use them at all oftentimes makes the term itself not very useful. Now, that does sound like a bit of a cop-out, so what I'm going to do instead is, rather than try to explain what new school is, because I think that's an even more nebulous term than old school, I'm going to say what lessons I have incorporated from old school DMing. I've been running games for a little over 24 years, so I have started on an older school mentality than I use today. I think I'm more probably 75% new school, 25% old school in a typical game. Although what game I'm running will change based on kind of the feel I want to go for. I might go for a more older school feel. So I want to talk about the individual elements of what I consider to be old school worth incorporating into a game. Because if you look at a lot of the stuff on my channel, what you're going to find is a pretty heavy slant towards that nebulous cloud I would call new school. So let's jump straight into it. The first thing that I would think to incorporate is the idea of goal-oriented play. In a lot of older games, at least what I consider to be old school, there is an element to the players having a thing that they want to go do and they want to go get. And oftentimes that drives a lot of stuff, right? The players have a desire. Oftentimes that desire is, I heard there's an epic sword at the bottom of this well, let's go explore it. Or I want to go into the dungeon to get gold to do a research, or something like that, right? You hear about something and you want to go get it for its own intrinsic value. We don't need this plot coupon to save the world. Instead, it's I as a person want to go get this thing because it'll give me wealth, it'll give me fame, it'll give me the ability to pursue my other goals. And oftentimes we would then form a group around that specific goal, which leads me to my second point, is the idea of a dynamic group. Now, there's a bunch of other pieces in this, but one of the things that we talk about a lot when we discuss DMing in a more modern context is tying the group together, giving the players a reason to stay together. And that is a little bit of a newer mentality, right? The idea that everyone needs this quest hook, everyone needs a reason and a relationship to stick together and maintain a static group to continue through the adventures. For a lot of players that are started in, say, 4th or 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, or on this sort of newer style, the idea that you would decide, I'm not going to take my barbarian on session today, I'm going to take my wizard instead, is baffling. If the wizard is playing instead of the barbarian, does that mean a different player is playing? No, that one player has a barbarian and a wizard, which brings us to point number 3, which is it is common for players to have multiple characters in their sort of stable in order to use. I might have both a barbarian and a wizard. I'm not choosing to come as a different player. I'm just playing a different character for miscellaneous reasons. There are different things in this particular quest that we're doing, this particular goal that we have set as a group that interests one character or the other, right? We're going to go raid an arcane library. I'm probably not going to bring the barbarian. Now, that being said, if the group is full of all asthmatic wizards and they need a front line, I might make some sort of deal with the group and say, okay, I'll bring the barbarian, but after we're done with the adventuring part of this, I need to do something to get my wizard here because my wizard will be really interested in what's going on here. So this idea of bargaining with this dynamic group, and the dynamic group can be player oriented, right? You can have things where typically the people that show are these 6 people, and maybe tonight there's only 4 of them. And there isn't really a mechanism that needs to be involved here. We don't have to then talk about, oh, what happens if your character misses a session, because that's part of the norm, right? If you're not there, you don't get the experience, you don't get the stuff that comes from that adventure because your character wasn't there. And the idea of us all being set at the same static level, right? Because we're all going to be in this together and we're all sticking together in this sort of static thing, and we want to be raising up through the ranks together, also goes away with a dynamic group. You can easily have characters of different levels and have that not be an issue, especially when the player has characters of different level, right? You might have a player that has a second, a fourth, and a seventh level character, and those things are all wanting to do different things, right? If there is something that is especially interesting to your seventh level character, you might bring it to a group full of level 2s and 3s because there is something you want to do. But the way that a lot of older school games work, that's not a huge problem that you have a higher level character. They're not going to invalidate the lower level characters because of the next thing, which is rule number 4. Powerful adventurers are the exception to the rule because adventuring is horrendously dangerous. Now, system by system, this sort of varies, but one of the more old school mentalities here is that there is sort of a death funnel, right? There's a pyramid. The food pyramid for monsters is a lot of low-level characters at the bottom and very few high-level characters at the top, because a lot of these games tend to be pretty lethal, right? You have the introduction of the idea of -10 being dead instead of 0 being 10 as something that happens during the time of old school, right? You're at 0 hit points. What happens when you run out of life? You die. That's how that works. Now, there are other systems that have different things in play. The game I'm going to be playing pretty soon uses a system where when you are reduced to 0 hit points, you make a check, and the sort of lower in the negative you got hit when you got put to 0, it alters your check depending on your constitution and some other things. We determine when you get knocked to 0, does this kill you? Does this wound you? Are you out for a day or a week or a month? That's going to be part of what's going on here. And that brings us to part number 5, and the idea of time passing is important in older school games, and that is something that we can bring into the newer school thing. One of the things that I hear a lot about people that are playing newer editions, pretty much at the point where an extended rest kind of recovers everything, pretty much any game where that's the norm, you have this strange concept where unless there is a reason to break the narrative flow of things, which there totally can be, and this is easy to do in many situations, but in some situations it's hard to convince players to not keep moving the plot forward. If they're interested and they want to do things, they want to go out and do things, and if they have the resources to do that because they took an extended rest and now all of their stuff is back, they're at full hit points, they've got all their spells, they've got all their magic items, they've got everything ready to go from one night's rest, they don't have a reason to put the brakes on. A lot of older school games do have reasons for you to put the brakes on. You have things like you need to spend downtime in order to craft new spells, to craft new magic items, to recover on the most basic level. The game I'm going to be playing pretty soon, which is hearkening back a little bit to the old school style, has you recover a hit point per day. If you recover 1 hit point per day and you've got 10 hit points, it's a very different feeling when you end the day at 3 hit points than it is if you get to recover all of your hit points when you take an extended rest, right? The idea of how time passes is a little different. And one of the sort of benefits of that, right, we're talking about the reasons to use this old school stuff, is the idea that sometimes it can be a little weird when players look back and go, we were like barely better than farmers in world, what was it, 2 months ago? And right now we're killing the god of war. It just feels a little weird. And that's fair. That is something that, if that bothers you, you might be able to take some of the lessons from the old school style in order to help you with that. Now, one of the other things there which we talk about is that idea of going and killing a god brings us to rule number 6, which is the old school style is using a system that is fairly rules light, that favors rulings at the table, right? You have this pretty simple system, and then you have the rulings at the table over something that has a rule for everything. There's definitely an argument to be made for the delineation between old school and new school being 3rd edition because of how much it meant to explain the minutia of things, and even looking at something like the 3rd edition version of how grappling works, where it's trying to make it to where you don't need a dungeon master or a judge in order to figure out exactly how the grappling rules work, right? You're going for rules rather than needing to have a ruling. And one of the things that this also promotes is the idea of this being a little bit more grounded, right? The idea of we're now 20, 30th level, whatever, and we're slaying the god of war. That's not really something that connects with a lot of the old school stuff. It's a little bit more grounded in reality, promoting this sword and sorcery thing where some of the minutia that we do not track often in the newer school things, how many arrows you have, how many rations you have, how much water you have, the frequent advice that I hear and what I use as well is those things aren't tracked until tracking them becomes dramatically relevant. In a lot of the older sword and sorcery stuff, they're very frequently relevant because, again, time is passing a lot more. You've got a lot more of a slower pace to things and lower levels of power, right? You're not superheroes where every single person just has a magical light source that lights up the entire region and you can just go and do whatever you want in broad daylight, even if it's the middle of some magical darkness, right? The idea is you have less resources. Tracking those lower resources actually becomes more important. And that brings us to point number 7, which is one of the old school rules, which is pretty important to this idea, is you use your brain and not what's on the character sheet, right? The characters are rules light. They're fairly simple. You don't have 1,000 different powers and abilities and superhuman crazy things that you're doing every 5 minutes that maybe some of them you don't even roll for because it's normal for you to just exude brilliant auras of light and that's just a Tuesday for your character. In this system, there is definitely an element of, okay, here is the problem. Your character sheet doesn't really have that many solutions. Oftentimes, what your character sheet gives you is ways to adjudicate different options that you come up with in your head, right? It's a focus on how do we approach this problem from the perspective of people in this world, and our character sheet gives us the tools that we need in order to approach that. So the idea that you would say, hey, put down your character sheet. Think about what this person would do. Think about what the room looks like. Ask questions, right? That mentality is more old school, right? Because you're thinking about this not as something that has been put in front of the players as a challenge that has a solution. So you're trying to find the solution in a more new school style or find the dramatic option. In old school stuff, it's more like, the air is the air. What can be done? This is what's going on here. Whether you can get over it or not is entirely up to you, which brings us to our last point, number 8. And counterbalance is secondary to verisimilitude or verisimilitude or vashashamamam, whatever you want to call that word. I know how to say it correctly. I just frequently say it wrong. It's secondary for you to have a balanced encounter. Something that if you drew it up on the whiteboard and someone said, hey, I want to make a challenging encounter for my level 7 characters and here's what they can do. That is less important, not unimportant. This is key. That is less important than having something that makes sense within the world, which means that you have oftentimes situations where there are radical level differences between things. And those radical level differences have an effect, an impact on the world. If you have an area that is filled with level 1 goblins, and in the middle of that area is a level 10 ogre, that level 10 ogre doesn't need to not exist, but he has a reason for being in the middle of that goblin horde, right? That ogre is the goblin king. He's the one that's holding that entire tribe on lockdown. If you have an evil undead death knight that's sitting in a tomb in the middle of an area that is mostly farmland, usually you have to have a reason why they are there, not because there are level 10 adventures and you need something cool for them to do in this area. The answer is there's a reason that guy is there, and there's a reason there are lower level things that are alive that he could unalive, and he has not done so because of ... And that ... that's the part where your players need to use their brain, not their character sheet, their brain. They need to figure out, okay, why does he not go out and murder things? And that element is very, good to bring into games, especially sandbox games, right? The whole time that we're talking on the channel, we're talking about sandbox games, and having the world feel a little bit more like it is there, it is how it is, and you can choose to interact with it in whatever way you so choose is an important piece of that, making the world feel big. And one of the elements here that people worry about in a newer school game, right, is if there is a challenge that is too hard, there is a challenge that gets you killed, there is something that you weren't ready for that level 10 ogre to be in the middle of the goblin encampment, and so you ran in with the assumption, right? The assumption that this is balanced for us because it is in front of us. This is a conquerable challenge at level 1 because we are level 1 and we can see it. That is not true in old school. And in a new school game where you have spent hours building this character, right? You've spent a lot of time and energy either physically writing it out because the system's fairly complicated, or even if it's just developing this person's backstory, right? Developing their family, developing who they're connected to, developing how you're connected with either players in the group, having these long-term aspirations. If that character gets turned into paste at level 2 because they decided to take on the ogre, there's a strong mismatch of expectations there, right? You expected, if you spent all this time in putting this character into play, that there would be an element of, I'm not going to come across something that's going to turn me into paste because dramatically my trajectory is way over there, right? And that's not really a thing in the older school mentality, right? You can have these grand adventures and things, but they're a little bit more organic, and oftentimes that is promoted by the fact that character creation is very fast. In the game that I'm going to be running pretty soon, character creation, you roll up 5 characters and you keep 3 of those 5 characters, and those characters each take less than 10 minutes to make. If you're familiar with the system, it probably takes you less than 5 minutes to make a character, to go from I have a blank sheet of paper to I am ready to play, 10 minutes. That is not true in a lot of games, and that way of quick turnaround can make lethality and the idea that the world is not balanced for you a lot more palatable. And there are newer school ways of translating that, right? You can have defeat is not death, right? You can have that if you have a newer school mentality where you want them to be able to lose. You can have things like ways to get back from the dead. You can have the adventure not end when they die. There are a lot of pieces that you can bring onto this, but the core example here is that the encounter is not balanced. The world is in some sort of homeostasis, right? That is the important part, is the world is in homeostasis and you are adventuring into a uneven terrain. So don't have even expectations, have uneven expectations. And again, you're gonna need to use your brain and not your character sheet, because if you decide, okay, the ogre is here, there's all this sort of stuff, we're level 1, but the ogre cares about his goblin minions. What if we led some of those goblin minions into a ravine and then we trapped them and burned them and brought the ogre along and set a trap, and when the ogre came in to rescue people that it was over top of, assuming this is a very nice ogre, then we drop stones on him from the top, and we're not using our character sheets for rolling 50 points of boulder damage that it ran down the hill. We're using our brains and we're setting up a situation where we can take on something that is a much bigger step above us. And while I did say that this was the last notion, there is another sort of side note, maybe a hidden 0.9, which is the reason that one of the encounter balances isn't as important is that these are not necessarily obstacles you overcome that then give you cookies on the other end when you level up, right? The level up is very simple. You're playing a rules light system, and in addition to the fact that the encounter isn't balanced, the encounter might not actually be what's important, right? You gain experience in these older systems and the older style by what you attain. Now, in a lot of old school systems, that is directly gold. You get 1 experience point per gold you get back to town. That's it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. You could do that exact same thing with a quest, right? You get 500 experience points if you get the Sword of Black Omen from wherever it is back to town or back to its rightful owner. Then you don't need it to necessarily be gold, right? It's still a very concrete goal, and how you get there is important. And very rarely in a lot of old school games is that goal kill the monster, right? If the ogre in the goblin encampment has the thing you need, has the Sword of Ill Omen, you can go and get it from that ogre by creating that exact same scene we talked about, right? If you can get the ogre convinced that he needs to go out of camp to help the goblins that are trapped and burning, you don't have to kill the ogre. You just sneak into camp, take the thing, and leave, and you get the reward you were actually there to get, right? This is much more goal-oriented, and that goal can change the dynamics of your group, and a player can bring the character that they have from their stable that makes the most sense to what's going on here, and hopefully that character has adventured a little bit and has a little bit under their belt so that they are the exception to the rule of people die very frequently and early, and hopefully that character can pull themselves away from whatever downtime activity they have or recovering from the goblin arrow that shot them in the knee to go into this rules light situation where the DM or judge is going to be giving them rulings on how to use their cool ideas that are not located on top of their character sheet in order to overcome an encounter that is in the world but is not balanced for them. One last thing that we're going to talk about a little bit is there is a lot of negativity surrounding old school. Different people have had problems with old school stuff, and there are things in the past of the hobby that we don't want to redo, right? There are reasons that some of this stuff was left in the bins of history that should be left in the bins of history, and I'm going to take a second to say which of those are there for me. And for what to leave in the bin, number one is the antagonistic DM, right? The idea that the DM is out to kill you. I'm going to tell you players the secret and tell you DMs the secret. If the DM wants to kill the players, they can, because they're not operating on rules, right? There isn't something that says an encounter must be exactly like this. If they're level 1 and you want to throw the giant red dragon at them, that's your prerogative. Now, hopefully you don't do that, or hopefully you have a reason for doing that and a way to approach it, but the idea of having an antagonistic DM, someone that's wanting to see their players fail, someone that's gleefully rolling their d20 at them, hoping to get a crit, that is something that can be left in the dustbin to history. Even when I'm running older school systems, I am rooting for my players, and I let my players know I am rooting for you. I want you to overcome this. Now, it might be very hard, but I want you to overcome this. And I also explained to them, hey, the reason that you have 3 characters you roll up in character gen is to make the sting lessened for when those characters die, or when at least one of those characters die, or when one of the characters is recovering, to let you go out and play something else, let you go out and do something else, right? The systems that are in place help those pain points, and I'm not here to punish you, right? That's non-antagonistic DMing. The second thing is problematic publications and topics. There's some garbage in older adventures and old school books and things like this. Recently, I had a conversation and we had run across a book that explained that the race of black-skinned humans got bonuses to their strength and penalties to their intelligence. You can just burn that straight out of the rule books and carry on with our lives. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to burn everything in that rule book. If in that same rule book you're like, oh, here's a really cool trap and some interesting puzzles and mechanisms and things, you can take those and use those and then burn the rest, right? The idea is you just don't repeat the stupid mistakes from history, and the hobby as it has evolved has had some pretty stupid mistakes and some blaxploitation and weird things about gender and equality and things like that, and positive parts of slavery. Nah. Leave that in the dustbin. Do not bring that into your new school game. Take from it anything that you can find that is good and worthy of including in your game. And by that same token, with combining those two elements together, but I think it's important enough to bring as its own thing, because it gets brought up a lot as old school stuff, is the idea of a gotcha moment, right? The idea that me as the DM is playing against you, and in that element, I am saying, you didn't roll ball bearings on the floor to know that the floor was sloped down very slightly, and now you're in level 2 of the dungeon, which is 1 level higher than level 1 was, and now these level 2 monsters are going to destroy you. Does that mean you can't do the gradual slope that they would have to learn? No, you can still definitely do that. But the idea should be presented in such a way that is non-antagonistic, haha, I got you. You didn't ask about this thing, so you didn't know. That's silly, right? You describe a room and there is something in the room that the characters would 100% think about, and the characters don't do that, and then you say, you said you fill the basin with oil, and as soon as you do, it sloshes up and lights the searing bright candle in the center of the basin, and the players go, whoa, 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 whoa. There was a candle in the middle of the basin? You're like, you didn't ask if there was anything on fire in the room before you started pouring oil into the basin, so I guess you're gonna have to deal with being on fire now. No, none of that. You are with your players. You want them to have fun. You want it to be a fun adventure. You can 100% challenge your players without trying to treat this as some hidden game where you're trying to make sure they ask all the exactly right questions in order to be able to survive to the end of the adventure. And the last sort of negative point here, which is built upon these previous concepts, is there is a feeling for a lot of people when they talk about old school adventures, old school DMing, an old school mentality, of the idea that difficulty is inherently good, hard is inherently good, and random is inherently difficult. What I mean by this is the low-level play in a lot of games. There's a bit of artifacting left there where in, for example, 5th edition D&D, at level 1, you are very squishy. You are likely to die if there are some unlucky things that come your way, unless the DM prevents that from occurring, works behind the scenes to make sure you don't explode, because you have very little hit points in the way that the mechanics and things work. You can go from being I'm injured to I'm completely dead relatively easily with some crits, especially on monsters that have bigger crit dice and things like that. The orc is one of the examples of he can just one-shot you randomly, and your squishy asthmatic wizard didn't really think they were in danger, and suddenly they're dead. The idea that random is difficult and difficult is good, thus random is good, or a random challenge is good, I can see where people are getting it from. So the idea of, again, these characters have very little as far as resources. A die can take away a lot of those resources, but that isn't inherently good as difficulty. It's not difficult if you step on a plate and then you randomly die. That's not difficult, that's capricious, that's arbitrary, right? And what I want to do when I take things from old school is to take the stuff that sort of gives the characters the feeling that the idea of adventuring is not only dangerous, but it is something you do as a point of desperation, right? You don't go out and adventuring if you have a good life and you're chilling on your farm and you don't really have any problems and there's nothing going on. You don't want to drop everything you're doing and go into the cave where the goblins are and risk your life for a bit of gold if you've got a wife and a family back home that you're perfectly happy with and you're enjoying your life. There's no reason to go and do this, just like there's no reason to pack up in the real world and decide, hey, I'm going to go into a war zone. Not a lot of people are going to want to do that unless they have a very strong motivation to do so, right? Soldiers have a strong motivation to do so because that is now their job, or that is what they want to sign up to do. You don't have the situation where you have a normal, static, safe life where you're not taking these life or death risks every day and suddenly decide, hey, my life is great and all, I'd like to go ahead and see if I can throw it away. That is not how things work, and the translation that people get a lot from that is to make the random difficulty of thing, the capricious world, become the capricious DM, and I do not ascribe to that. So I hope that this answers the actual question. I'm sorry that it wasn't completely what was asked. Right? The question that was actually posed was, can I explain the difference between old school DMing and the idea of it being more challenging, monster driven style, this dungeon crawling thing, and then the newer school being a little bit easier, more story driven, epic style, that sort of thing. I don't really think of those things as the way that the schools are designed, right? I don't have that conceptualization. One of the elements being like, I don't think that having easy and hard as straight things is a good determiner, because you can have a very hard game as a new school mentality, right? You can make really hard decisions with this incredibly plot driven story where you make a decision and you're sitting there going, man, this is going to affect the next year of my playing of this game. What I decide here is a really tough choice. And I don't think that's any less difficult, any less hard, any easier than having a game that your hard decisions are the character's life in their hands, because it's still going to affect you as the player for a long time, right? Both versions of that are going to affect the player. They're going to be different, but they will affect them at a problem. And going, how easy is this to solve? That's a really tough question to answer. So I hope this video answered the question close enough. And if it did not, please comment again. Tell me what you want to hear about in the comments down below.